Let's see. Ah, there we go. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Preenon. I'm the Director of Communications for the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, and I'd like to welcome you. This is our first, actually, Breakfast with Benefits for 2024. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. We have a great program today. Bill Tillingast is here from Fresh Maintenance, and he was here with us sometime last year, a very popular program on don't let household mold kill your real estate deal. And we're going to find out all about all different kinds of mold, what kind are dangerous, what we should do, what you should do if your client, your buyer, or your seller finds mold in the house. And we would love to see some of you who don't have your cameras on. Come on, y'all. I got to put my camera on. I got to do my hair and brush my teeth and also would love to see y'all. There we go. All righty. Uh, without further ado, Bill, welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mary. I will try and share my screen with you here so we can get started. Can everybody see that? Right. So, again, thank you for having me here this morning. It's a pleasure to be speaking with all of you. I'd like to thank Mary Preenon and the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors for helping set all of this up. As Mary said, we'll be talking about household mold this morning, and more specifically how it applies to real estate transactions. I'll tell you that we do a good amount of mold cleanups that are the direct result of pending real estate transactions, and the vast majority of those deals close. For some reason, they don't close. It's generally not because of the mold, but some other issues. Mold is fairly common in real estate transactions because most of the time the homeowner isn't aware that there's an issue with mold, and then something's discovered during the home inspection or some other process during the contract period. So our company is Fresh Maintenance. We're a restoration business. We do water, fire, cleanup, located in Westchester County, and our work in the tri-state area. So that includes Rockland County, Putnam, Dutchess, along with northern New Jersey and Fairfield County, Connecticut. We're licensed in the state of New York for mold remediation. We carry all the necessary insurance. The company's been in business about 20 years. Again, my name is Bill Tillinghast. I'm licensed in the state of New York as a mold contractor / supervisor. All of our contact information is on the screen. Feel free to take a screenshot for your records, and feel free to reach out to us anytime. If you have any questions about mold, any remediation issues, pending transaction, or a buyer that's just thinking about putting a home on the market or anything, reach out to us anytime. Happy to answer any questions that we can. So today we're going to be talking about these four things. What is mold? I'm going to talk about what mold is. I'm going to be talking about the laws, especially as they apply to real estate transactions. Um, Identifying some of the sources of mold. What are some of the more common causes of mold in the household? We obviously can't talk about every source of mold. And then how we get rid of it. So what is mold? Mold is a fungus or a fungi. It's not a plant. Plants use photosynthesis to make their own food. Mold relies on substances around it that they digest to make their own food. But it is alive. It's a living thing, so it can be killed. And mold is everywhere. It's outside. It's inside. For those of us who went to an office this morning, we brought mold with us. We're in our house. We brought it from one room to another. We're breathing it in and out all day long. Really, the only places above ground that don't have mold are clean room environments that have been artificially filtered with high efficiency filters and air moving equipment. To just get a perspective of how much mold there is, mold represents 75% of the Earth's biomass. And biomass is the total amount of organic matter in the world. And so mold makes up most of that. And mold spores are about 5 microns in size, an individual spore. And a micron is 1/1,000,000th of a meter or 1,000th of a millimeter. So obviously at 5 microns, and visible particles are going to be probably about 1/10 of a millimeter. That's when you can start to see them. Mold spores being much smaller than that, you need a lot of them before you can start to see them. And to start to see any significant staining, you need an awful lot. But the way mold produces is like exponentially. It doubles each time. So 2 spores make 4 spores, make 8 spores, make 16, and on and on and on. And you'll be surprised how quickly you can get up into the millions of spores. So once it starts to grow, it multiplies much quicker. After an event, mold can start to grow in 2, 3, maybe 4 days, and it can start to become visible as you get enough of it after probably about 2 weeks or so. So if you do have an event, where there's water, something gets wet, you really want to start to try and dry that out as quick as possible. So is mold bad? Well, that depends. There's a lot of types of mold, over 100,000 types of mold. Some of it's good, some of it's bad, some of it we need, and some of it can make you sick. It's unhealthy. Some of it can make you very sick. So how much mold is bad? How do you know when you have too much mold? There's no defined amount that says this is too much mold. There's no statute, there's no regulation or law that says, yeah, this is too much mold. The way it's determined is comparing how much mold is outside, how much is inside. Remember, there's mold everywhere. And if there's a significantly larger amount of mold inside than outside, then there may be an issue with mold. And in order to do that, we first have to determine how much mold is outside. And then we compare. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of bad mold. So a lot of people start to realize that there might be an issue with mold when they get that damp, musty odor. Nothing smells quite clean. There's something going on. It affects people differently. Some people are more allergic than others. We can get 10 people in a house. 4 people might have allergic reactions. 1 person might get really sick. 5 people may not be affected at all. It tends to affect very young and the very old a little bit more. Young people, their immune systems aren't fully developed. Older people, their immune system has gotten a little bit weaker, and so they don't have the ability to fight off some of the issues there. People with breathing issues, asthma, people with just more allergic, pre-existing conditions, it varies. And only a doctor can really identify what is making you sick and if mold is the cause of that. And then some of the very bad molds, they also produce myotoxins. And those are the things that can make you seriously ill. We say seriously ill, it's from a legal standpoint, it's never been proven in a court of law that anyone has died of mold. That's not to say no one has never died of mold. It's never just been shown to be the case, but it can make some people very ill. And again, it varies from person to person. So, these are some examples of some bad mold. Uh, some of you may never hear these names again, but I wanted to mention them. If you ever see a mold report, and what it does, it actually lists the names of mold. It doesn't say, good mold, bad mold, bad mold, good mold, right? It lists the names, and if you don't know what they are, it's probably meaningless. I list these three. They're moles that we run into quite a bit when there's remediation to be done. They're considered bad moles. Aspergillus, or also penicillin, same name, Cladosporium, and Stachybotrys. There's no quiz or anything. You don't have to write these down, but just to make you aware. And the third one, Stachybotrys, that's sometimes referred to as a black mold. That's one of the really bad molds. It's a serious variety. It's one we really want to pay attention to. We want to make sure that's taken care of properly. We don't want any of those spores to spread anywhere else, because that's one that can produce myotoxins, and pay special attention to. So can So can mold be good? Of course, mold can be good. It's in some cases actually necessary. It's nature's way of breaking things down when they die. You get trees that fall, forest, leaves, all the organic matter. If there was no mold, there'd be no decay, and we'd never get rid of it. Things would just pile up and pile up and pile up. So it's nature's way of decaying, of getting rid of things, and just kind of completing a cycle. Not just with trees, but with anything that dies. Obviously, in food production, the first thing that comes to mind is cheese. There's a lot of cheeses that use mold, blue cheese, Roquefort, all of those. Some people really like them, some don't, but it's important in the production of food. And then medicine. Everyone's familiar with penicillin, how it was discovered from mold. And so a lot of the antibiotics are developed from mold. It was a big game changer when it comes to fighting disease and obviously extending life. So there is good mold, and there is bad mold. So we do need mold. We just want to be able to figure out which mold we have and get rid of the bad ones. So let's talk about the laws. This is some of the important things now. What do you have to do? So who can tell you if you have mold, where you have mold, and what needs to be done? Who can perform the cleanup, and then who decides when the mold is gone? Well, again, the answer is it depends. At least from a legal standpoint, if we're in Connecticut or New Jersey, almost anyone can do these things. Again, that's legal, not necessarily practical. Your neighbor could do these things, I can tell you. There are no laws in those states that govern how mold remediation has to happen. In New York, only specific people can do these things. There's no national law regarding mold. Most states don't have mold. There's about a half dozen states, give or take, that do have some mold laws or regulation. It's kind of random as to which states they are. It's not regional, north, south, east, west, red state, blue state. California, Texas, Florida, Tennessee, those are some of the states. New York State is also one of the states that has mold, and they have to be followed when there's mold in the house. So the mold laws in New York were implemented in 2016 after one of the large hurricanes. It was a little bit of the Wild West. People were showing up, trying to take care of things, didn't really know what was going on, and things were a little out of control. So the state decided they should implement something. So what they did was they literally took the existing asbestos laws and they crossed out the word asbestos and they wrote mold. So the mold laws and regulation exactly mimic the asbestos laws. And so for that reason, there are two professions that are associated with mold remediation in New York. Those are mold inspectors or assessors. Same person, it's just they're called two different things, but the same thing. And then mold remediation contractors. And both have to be licensed by the state. So mold inspectors or assessors. Before any remediation can take place in New York, the mold assessor must inspect the property determined that there's mold. Now, a home inspector is not the same thing as a mold inspector. There are some home inspectors that are also mold inspectors, but they're separate classifications, and you can't assume that a home inspector is a mold inspector. And in New York, there is no mold until a mold inspector says so. Before that, it is a mold-like substance or something along those lines. If you look at a home inspection report, most of the time you'll probably see something like contamination, a mold-like substance, or something like that. Until a mold inspector comes in, observes and does tests and determines that there's actual mold, it's considered that there's no mold in the house. And then after the mold inspection comes in and does the inspection, he then prepares a mold assessment report. Once that report is put together, the mold remediator can then come in and do the cleanup, and then the assessor may be called back on a clearance test. That is not required by law. That's more a preference by the homeowner. So the mold report. This is part of what you pay for when you hire a mold inspector. So their mold report should include a number of things, including the initial observations that the mold inspector sees, the tests that they performed, the results of those tests, the conclusions that the mold inspector had, and then a remediation protocol. Exactly what has to be done, where the mold is, what has to be cleaned, and the like. And sometimes they might include some other information. Sometimes mold inspector will include an estimated range of potential cost of the job and other items. Maybe they recommend using certain products or something like that. But those are the important things. So mold remediation. Any company that performs mold remediation in the state of New York must be licensed with the state, specifically for remediation. And each company is required to have at least one person that is licensed as a contractor / supervisor for mold. Again, that's just in the state of New York. Another important stipulation in New York is that whoever does the remediation cannot be the company that does the inspection. They have to be two separate companies. There can't be any conflicts on the job. A company can perform both functions, but they cannot perform it on the same job. It's two completely companies involved there. And the remediator should follow the protocol that's on that report. And again, the important thing is to get rid of the mold. Everybody may have procedures that vary a little bit. The mold industry is not that old, but the way you get rid of mold has changed quite a bit over the past 20 years. And if a mold report says, well, you have to sand and then encapsulate and everything like that, that may be what you had to do 20 years ago. The idea is to get rid of the mold. Okay. Mold remediators should also warranty their work, and they have to be properly insured. In order to get licensed in New York, the company has to be properly insured but license is only renewed every 2 years. Chances are, if they're in business still, they're properly insured. But if you want to double check that, that's fine. Okay, so what happens after the remediation? Are we finished? Sometimes, especially when there's a real estate transaction involved, one of the parties, usually the buyer, will require that mold inspector come back for clearance test just to show that the mold is all gone. It's no longer an issue. And there's usually an additional charge for that. But the inspector will come back in, he'll do the tests, and he'll show that mold is no longer an issue and give you a clearance test. So once the house has been cleared, is the problem solved? In terms of closing that transaction, you should be good to go. The mold is gone, but if the cause of the mold hasn't been taken care of, the mold will just grow back. Our warranty will cover the work that we've done, but it requires that whatever the source of the mold was has to be fixed. If there's water coming in the house and it keeps coming in, doesn't matter how well you you clean up that mold, it's going to just keep growing back. So it's important to stop that. Sometimes there's, it's an ongoing maintenance thing, keeping the humidity down or whatever, and that falls on the new buyer. But if you don't stop the source, it's just going to grow. And then what has to be disclosed when mold is found in a house? I'm sorry. So I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to be giving any legal advice about this, but I have been told by some different real estate attorneys that the laws and regulations in New York around home disclosure are set to change in March. And, so what happened in the past, what you were able to do in the past, may not be the case later this year. What has to be disclosed might be a little different. Everybody's situation is unique. I would just suggest that you and your client speak with a real estate attorney about your specific case and just get clarification on what has to be disclosed going forward. So exceptions, like a lot of laws, there are always exceptions to them, and these are some. If you're the homeowner, you can do anything you want as it applies to mold. You don't have to, you can serve as your own inspector, you can serve as your own remediator, you can take care of everything yourself. You do the same thing with this. If you own a house and you find asbestos, you can take that asbestos, you can get rid of it, and you can just throw it out in the construction trash. No fines, no penalties, you've done nothing wrong. King of the castle. That's not necessarily, I wouldn't advise that, but from a legal standpoint, you're allowed to do that. So if there's less than 10 square feet of mold in a house, you don't have to go out and hire the mold inspector to take care of it. It's a very small amount. And so you can get around that. Some other ones are, if you're an apartment owner, an employee of the apartment owner, you can take care of it. Same thing with building management agents and their employees, and then government owned housing. Government employees can take care of that themselves. Now, that said, even though they're allowed, it's not necessarily a good idea. I mean, I can tell you in each of those instances, we've been called in to do the work. It's that way it's done right. In most of the cases, a mold inspector is hired just to identify where the mold is. And a lot of times it can actually be more cost effective than some of these people doing it themselves. So just a recap of what we do if there's mold, especially in New York. The potential issue is identified. The mold inspector comes in and confirms that there's actually mold, then puts out a mold report. The mold remediator is brought in to actually get rid of the mold. The mold is gone. Mold inspector comes back in, provides a clearance test, and then obviously fix the cause of the mold. It's listed last. That doesn't necessarily have to happen last. It should probably start happening as soon as possible. It can happen before, during, and after this whole process. But you want to stop whatever caused the mold. That's as important as anything else. So let's talk about what's required for mold to grow. What does mold need? Well, mold needs three things. It needs air, it needs an organic food source, and it needs water. Mold grows best in kind of the temperature range that people like and they need. So mold is going to be where people are, right? They both kind of survive in the same environment. So that's why, refrigerators are kept at 39 degrees and lower. The lower temperature slows down the mold growth, slows down the decay, and it keeps food longer. You want to keep food a lot longer, stick it in the freezer. Colder temperature, slower mold growth, slower decay. So for air, mold needs oxygen. It won't grow underwater. So you won't find mold growing at the bottom of the ocean. If you look at the tide line, on a dock or on a pier or something, you obviously see mold growth, but that's because the water goes up and then down. So part of the time it's actually exposed to the air, but it needs air to grow. It also needs an organic food source. So that means anything that comes from living matter. That's wood, that's paper. You get paper on the front and back of drywall. You get it on one side of fiberglass insulation. You get cotton in the padding of carpets. A lot of people in the basement will store things in cardboard boxes. Anything organic will provide a food source for mold. Now, it won't grow on inorganic things. It won't grow on stone. It won't grow on concrete. It won't grow on synthetics. But the spores can collect on those things, and mold can grow on dirt that's collected on those things. But the inorganic materials themselves will not provide a food source. And then it also needs water. So it's going to be very difficult to build and sell a house without air and an organic food source, right? So that leaves water that we have to go after. So if we want to stop mold, we have to prevent water. And these are some of the sources of water that can create mold in the house. Obviously, these are not the only, but these are some of the common ones that we run into and ones that should obviously be addressed. High humidity. This is very common, especially in the summer. Basements and attics get humid. Sometimes the entire house does. People go away, they don't have their air conditioning running or whatnot. Humidity levels should be 50% or lower in a house at all times. Mold will grow. The actual percentage is a little higher than 50%, but you want to have a buffer. If you have a dehumidifier set to 50%, it's kind of like a thermostat. You have your thermostat set to 70, 75 degrees, 65, whatever it is. So that's the temperature right by the thermostat. But 15 feet away, it might be a little different. Same thing with humidity. 50 or below at the dehumidifier, it might be a little bit higher away from that. So you want to have a little bit of a buffer. That will go a long way to keeping mold out of your house, keeping the humidity low. Standing water. You get water that spills and is there a while, can be soaked up by organic materials. If there's enough of it, it can cause what's called a humidity spike or humidity bloom. and you can get mold growth on the walls as a result of that. Organic materials not being properly dried out. After a big flood, we've had some pretty big storms the past year and a half or so, especially in terms of a lot of rain in a short amount of time. And we get all sorts of calls with people getting flooded. And then occasionally we'll get a call back saying, never mind, the water receded on its own. Now you can't see it sometimes, but the water is still there. Okay. The walls have soaked up that water. They stay wet. The insulation behind it, that paper soaked it up. Some of the flooring material, some of the things that are stored in there have soaked it up. And if that stuff is not dried out properly, it's a breeding ground for mold. There's an actual science to drying things out. You have to dehumidify the air because you have to dry the air out enough, because we're going to be blowing fans on the wet materials to cause evaporation. That evaporation goes into the air, and if the air is not dry enough to absorb it, we're just going to be spreading moisture around the house, and it's actually going to make the situation worse. So if there's a water, it's important that things be dried out properly. If there's any organic material. If it's a completely unfinished basement, concrete everywhere, completely empty, probably not as much of an issue. But if there's walls, if there's flooring material, if there's things stored down there, you want to make sure everything's addressed so you don't get a bigger problem a month out. Broken pipes and leaking roofs are a big source of water. Obviously, you get a big freeze. It was cold a few days ago. The winter hasn't been as cold as we've had in years past, but you get a big freeze, and sometimes people go to a sink and they realize they're not getting water. They identify it early enough, but that doesn't always happen. So sometimes when the big freeze happens, isn't the problem. It's when the thaw happens and things start to thaw out. If a pipe breaks, you get a big water leak, you can figure it out pretty quickly as long as you're home. If you're away, that's another issue. But sometimes you don't get a huge break, you get a leak, and it's slow. And water accumulates slowly over time. And by the time you realize there's an issue, mold has grown, and it was so slow you didn't identify it. So if you get a deep freeze, and there are pipes that tend to freeze up, it might be a good idea to inspect all of them after that to make sure you're not getting any leaks, and get things dried out properly. If people are going away on vacation, good idea to turn off the main water supply to the house. So if pipe does break, you don't get a huge disaster. Poor ventilation. Poor ventilation is a huge issue in attics, especially. You've got, if you're not getting enough ventilation, moving that air around, humidity, water starts to collect up there, and it can cause mold. Sometimes soffits get plugged up. People over-insulate their attics. Sometimes the vent gap on the top gets clogged up if the new shingles are put up. A lot of people are renovating, and the initial design has changed. So what you had good airflow before doesn't happen again. So these are all things that contribute to some problems. And then condensation, air exchange. This is another bit. If you've ever been in an old house with the old windows, a single pane of glass, very cold day out, freezing outside, glass is cold, warm inside, and you actually get water forming on the windows. It's kind of like in the summertime, you go outside early in the morning and you've got dew on the grass. Cold air will not hold as much water as warm air. So when warm air hits something cold, the air gets colder and it loses the water. In the wintertime, what happens is you get warm air in a house, and that rises up through the attic. If it's an unfinished attic, the insulation usually on the floor of the attic, and then that warm air hits that cold roof, and you get water that forms right on that roof. And there are some occasions you go up there and you can actually see small icicles kind of forming on some of those nails. And if you don't have enough ventilation, kind of clearing that stuff out, that's your source of water. So those air exchanges are a big part of the issue there. And then getting back to broken pipes, water coming off the roof, gutters, we find can be a big source of the problem here. You want when gutters are designed to take, or should be designed to take water about 8-10 feet away from your house. A lot of the gutters go into the ground, and there's a 90-degree elbow, and then the water is drained away. Over time, the weight of the ground will actually crush that 90-degree elbow. So when water used to be drained 10 feet away, it's now collecting right by the side of the house. So people say, oh, we never had this problem before. It's coming in. Well, there's a new problem there. So you want to make sure the gutters are still working properly. And then the grading of the landscape. Sometimes people will have new landscaping done, or in some cases, the house has never been graded properly. But you want to make sure all the water is running away from the house. Those two things will probably take care of over 50% of the problems with water getting into people's basement right there. And in terms of just getting back to ventilation again, the mold industry is relatively new. We've always had mold, but it hadn't been such a widespread problem that a whole industry could spring up from it. It really started in the 80s and 90s. They started making homes and commercial buildings much tighter for energy conservation, cheaper to cool, cheaper to heat. As a result of that, the ventilation went way down. And as a result of that, the amount of mold in homes really started to grow. And then as a result, people became much more aware of it as well. So let's talk about the remediation, the cleanup. First thing we want to make sure of is that we don't make a situation worse. If there's a mold situation that's identified in one room or one part of the house, we don't want to spread it to other parts of the house. So we may have to build some sort of containment barrier. We may have to put up some sort of, if it's an open doorway, we may have to put up a temporary doorway in there to keep the contamination in. And then sometimes we may have to set up what's called negative air, where we're actually removing air, filtered clean air from the space out, so that air from the outside is forced to come in. We're not pushing any dirty air out. We're making air from the outside come in. So everything's kind of sucking in on a space. And the only air that leaves is the filtered air. When we talk about mold remediation, are we trying to kill, or are we trying to remove the mold? What do you think? We remove it. Mold spores, they've got spikes on them, histamines or whatever. So even if a mold spore is dead, it can still cause an allergic reaction. So just killing the mold isn't going to accomplish the whole issue. We want to actually remove it. We want to get rid of it. And the process for removing the mold can vary depending on the situation. There are wrong ways to do that. There are wrong ways to remove mold, but it's not necessarily just one right way. We need to dispose of any contaminated materials. We need to treat the remaining materials with an antimicrobial, and then we have to HEPA vacuum. We have to vacuum those surfaces with a filtered vacuum to actually remove those spores. Or we have to wipe them down with something that collects them. The HEPA vacuum has that hospital grade filter on it again, which is going to capture all of those mold spores. We treat the unfinished surfaces with an antimicrobial. If it's an area that's not finished, an attic or something like that, And we use an antimicrobial that actually pulls the embedded mold spores out of the surface. Again, that's something that's changed over the years. Years ago, you had to actually sand that stuff off. In some cases, in a finished surface, we might actually be able to remove the mold spores from that finished surface. Sometimes we can't, we have to actually remove the drywall. And then we'll run air scrubbers, which are fans with those hospital grade filters on them to filter out the air to get rid of any airborne mold spores. In some cases, we might have to fog an area to help get rid of the mold. And in some cases, we might have to encapsulate. That means we have to put coating, sealant. Sometimes there's an area we can't get to, or it would require removing too many things that the homeowner just doesn't want. So we actually seal the area and the mold behind it. It's not always ideal. Sometimes after we remediate, we'll encapsulate something if we think it's bound to become contaminated again. But those are some of the things we do. So in terms of removing the contaminated material, if you look at the picture here, the one on the left, the bottom part of this wall was contaminated with mold, couldn't be removed. In some cases, there's also insulation behind it, and that paper has mold on it. So the drywall has to actually be taken out, disposed of, as does the insulation. The one on the right, we had a water situation in the floor above it. Water came down, wasn't taken care of properly. Mold started to grow, so the drywall had to be removed. That was moldy, disposed of, and then we had to treat all the unfinished wood behind it to get rid of any mold spores there. Again, this is the air scrubber. It does two things in this case. It's cleaning out the air, and it's got a big filter on it. It's a fan, and over time, all the air in that room will go through that air scrubber, and then it's also creating that negative air pressure, right? It's pushing air out, so that plastic is actually sucked in. So if air is going to move from one room to another, it's going to come in. So clean air is going to come in from the outside. We're not pushing dirty air to the outside. So when we're doing remediation, do we use bleach? People always say, hey, use bleach. I Googled it, use bleach, use vinegar. We do not use straight bleach to remediate mold. Bleach is very good at killing bacteria. It's less effective on mold. It's very good about removing the color from mold. So initially it looks like the mold is all gone. But especially household bleach, it's about 5% chlorine when it leaves the factory, and it starts to dissipate pretty quickly. So the amount of chlorine is actually lower once you get it home usually. What it'll do is it'll destroy some of the surface mold, but the deeper embedded stuff is still there. And then that other 95% of the material is water, right? So now you've left a huge food source for the remaining mold. So many times when you use bleach, it takes the color out, kills a little bit of it, but the mold actually will grow back sometimes stronger than was there before. So we don't use household bleach. There are products that are manufactured for mold remediation that do have bleach mixed in with them with other products, which make them more effective at destroying the mold. Now, it's a higher concentration of bleach. It's specifically designed. Those can be very caustic, dangerous to work with. They should only be used by professionals wearing the proper protection. We would only use those in certain circumstances anyways. But you should never mix anything with bleach. You should never really mix any chemicals, but you should never mix anything with bleach. I'll bet most people on this have bleach at home or have had bleach at home. They might be out. And I'll bet most have ammonia, right? Ammonia is used as a glass cleaner. It's in Windex, and some people just have straight ammonia. What happens when you mix bleach with ammonia? Does anybody know? You get mustard gas. Mustard gas killed a lot of people in World War I. So if you mix those two together and it's not ventilated, you could end up unconscious. It could be a very bad situation. So you always want to be careful with chemicals. You don't want to be mixing things at home. And you just want to be careful about what you use when, especially if you Google things online. So here's an addict that's being treated. We do a lot of addicts. It's very common. A lot of addicts are found to have mold during real estate transaction. It's because if people don't have finished addicts, a lot of times they seldom, if ever, go up there. Maybe they have some stuff stored up there. Maybe they have some of their air handling equipment up there. But a lot of people just never go up there. And so it's not uncommon when a home inspector goes up there. It's been a long time since anyone's gone up there. And they find mold or they find other contaminants, rodents are up there. Sometimes the insulation has to be removed as well. So here's a remediator, treating some of the wood. Here's a before and after picture of some of the roofing for a mold job. You see on the left, you can see some of the black staining from the mold, and on the right, that's afterwards. Here's another one. I think this might actually be a crawl space. Crawl spaces can be particularly troublesome because a lot of times there's just dirt, there's ground on the bottom, so it becomes extra damp. Sometimes you actually have to install a vapor barrier as well. But attics and crawl spaces, very susceptible. So just to recap again, and again, feel free to reach out to us anytime. If there's a suspected mold problem in a house, you can give us a call. We'll answer any questions, run through this process. I know we've gone through a lot here. Sometimes people are in a hurry to close on both sides. They don't actually want to get the work done. They want an idea as to what a project would cost, and a credit is negotiated between the parties. We're happy to walk anybody through the process and be as helpful as we can. But again, you contact the remediation company for any advice you need. Hire a mold inspector. We can help you with that if you need recommendations from mold inspectors in a certain area. Get the mold report. You hire the remediator. Remediator cleans out the problem. A lot of times, the buyer will want a clearance test. It's not required. It's usually an added fee, but you get the clearance test, and then you close the transaction. That's the process. One thing I'll say is, if you do have a client that's considering selling their home and they suspect that there's mold in it, it's a good idea to get it taken care of before you get into a contract situation, or, ideally before you list it. And that's not just for mold, that's for a lot of issues like oil tanks and the like. It's just much easier resolving any of these situations when you're the only person involved. When there's a buyer involved, you kind of lose control of the process. There's other people, negotiating, telling you what they want. So the earlier you can get on this, the easier it is.
Bill, we did have quite a few questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let me take a look here.
Okay.
This is our contact information. Let's see. All right. When do insurance companies pay for mold test and remediation? Again, I don't want to make any blanket statements. Everybody's insurance policy is a little different. But I will say that a lot of insurance policies have exceptions to mold. They won't cover mold, or they have a limit on the amount they will cover. And generally, if mold is going to be covered under an insurance policy, it has to be the result of some specific occurrence. So if water comes in because of a flood from the outside, that's kind of an act of nature. That's not covered. If a pipe breaks, you get a water problem and mold grows as a result of that. You have to address the water right away, but sometimes mold still grows. Generally, you have the best chance of having mold covered in that. It's got to be some sort of something that broke, and it can't be kind of a wear and tear issue. If something kind of wore out over 20 years, sometimes you run into issues with that. If a valve breaks or something like that, you have a chance, but it's got to be. And again, you have to talk to your insurance company about this specifically. Everyone's different, but generally it's got to be the result of some particular occurrence. All right. So how would you pinpoint mold if nothing is visible? Do you smell it or it shows up on a mold test of the air? Well, again, this is part of what the mold inspector will do. First thing they'll do is they'll take an air sample outside the house. They'll get an idea as to what the amount of mold is outside, and then they'll come inside to the areas they suspect there's mold, and they'll take an air sample. That way you can see if there's a big disparity in mold counts. So there might just be a lot of airborne mold. They'll also take swab tests. It's kind of like a COVID test, like a big Q-tip. They'll rub it on a surface, they'll close it up. The air test, those swabs, they overnight to a lab, and those labs process those, and they give the results back. So you may find that, in the basement, there's a tremendous amount of mold, not really much mold on the first floor. There's mold on certain areas, or maybe mold started to grow on some items that have gotten, got wet. So maybe those items have to be thrown away, and then we have to wipe down everything on that floor, and then we have to run those air scrubbers for a few days to clean out the air. But that's kind of how you pinpoint where mold is or isn't. It's through that inspection and through testing. That's your best chance. With regard to the acceptance, can you please clarify whether the homeowner or apartment owner can do it themselves, irrespective of mold size, or only if it's less than 10 square feet? If you own a home, when it comes to mold, you can do whatever you like. You can remove all the contents that you think are contaminated. You can clean off, replace. If you're the homeowner, you're allowed to do anything you want. There's no requirement. The 10 square feet doesn't just apply to the homeowner. That's anyone. If you want to have somebody come in and take care of, a 2-foot area of mold, that's fine. You're not necessarily going to know if there's mold somewhere else in the house, but if water spilled in an area, you never took care of it, and there's a 2-foot mold growth, what we'll do is, we'll cut out the contaminated area, and then we'll keep removing it until we get kind of a clear area. Because sometimes what you see on the front isn't what you get on the back. But if it's less than 10 square feet, you don't have to go through the full process. But the homeowner and the apartment owner, from a legal standpoint, are allowed to do whatever. The mold laws where you have to bring in an assessor, then you have to hire a mold remediator, that you don't have to do. If a house near mine is having mold remediation, does that put my house and others at risk while they're doing remediation? As long as there's an outside gap, I mean, if it's a townhouse and they're right next to each other and they share some sort of space, or there's some way for, the contaminated air to get from one to the other, then you might have an issue. If there's some sort of airspace, then it shouldn't be an issue. You've got that buffer. there's already mold outside, and it will, how do I say, diffuse. It'll dissipate over a much larger area once it gets outside. So you shouldn't have to worry about that getting into your house. Um, it's really if you get a water issue, something gets wet in your house, and you get mold kind of growing in your house. That's really an issue you want. If you're particularly worried about something, you can just keep your windows closed on that side of the house while it's going on, but it really shouldn't be an issue if there's a buffer zone. Did I miss any questions?
I think you got, unless anyone has any other questions. Thank you, Bill. This was a great presentation, and I think we all learned a lot. I know I had mold when I first bought my house too, and they had to take out a lot of the sheetrock, and it was I just had a question. I mean, when I had mine done, it was some time ago, but what are the cost ranges for mold remediation?
Um, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, it can vary from, if there's mold, a couple thousand to tens of thousands. I mean, we've seen huge areas, sometimes there's commercial pools, things like that, whole houses where all the drywall has to be removed, the insulation has to be removed, everything has to be treated. It can get huge. I would say most of the jobs we do are between 3 and 10,000. Sometimes the larger ones will get up into, the teens and 20s. Occasionally there's some very large ones, whole houses that are affected. But it's very hard to just put a price on it. Um, we're not a franchise business; we're independent, and so we kind of price things based on how much of the materials we're using and how long it's going to take. Some people are very formulaic and punch everything in, so it itemizes everything. So the prices may add up higher. So I don't want to speak for other companies as to what they may or may not charge. Um, if it is an insurance job, insurance requires that you itemize everything. So insurance jobs actually end up costing more simply by the way you have to itemize it versus someone paying out of pocket. At least from our standpoint, we don't go through the trouble of itemizing everything out. But that's a that's a starting range, anyways. I don't want to set anything too low if you get a really big mold situation, but um, that's a good indication for a lot of the jobs we do. And
And
especially if it's a situation where the homeowner is not even aware there's a mold problem, and there's mold in the attic, you know. And again, that's for the remediation. If we're taking out drywall, if insulation's got to remove, that's got to be put back together. So the reconstruction is an added cost. And flooring material comes out, there's huge variations in the type of flooring material people put back in. So sometimes it's based on the products people choose to put back in and things like that. So
one more question. Someone is asking, how accurate are the mold testing kits that you can buy in Home Depot and stores like that?
um, how accurate are they? I think they're a good starting point. Um, Part of the issue with testing is knowing where to test and where to look. Um, so if you're testing the right areas, that they should give you an indication that there is or isn't mold. I don't know how. I haven't used them myself, so I don't know if they actually identify which molds they are. If they do, you then have to be able to identify which are the good molds, which are the bad molds, and then more importantly, if there are some of the really bad molds. That's where you want to be careful. You don't want to be spreading stack of buckets around the house. Um, uh, some of the other, none of them you want to spread, but when a mold inspector finds some of the really bad molds that create mycotoxins, they pay particular attention to that, and there's an extra detail that they go through. So it's it they're better than not having anything. I think they're a good starting point, but I don't think that you want to make all your final conclusions based on say that.
Well, thank you, Bill, so much. This has been really great, really informative, and we're going to be sending the recording out to everyone probably later this afternoon, and it will have Bill's contact information. And there it is again. If you want to just jot it down, you want to reach out to them, and you cover all of the Hudson Valley, Bill?
Yeah, we'll do the tri-state area. We'll do Rockland, Westchester, Putnam, Dutchess, Fairfield County, northern New Jersey. We don't really go a whole lot farther than that. But if there were a really huge job, we have had situations where there's a number of jobs in one area. We may travel to it to take care of it. But that's generally the service area. Great. We're not restricted by some territory.
Okay.
But anyway, again, thank you again. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Company is Fresh Maintenance. My name is Bill Tillinghast. That's our contact information, and feel free to reach out with any questions you have, anything that comes up.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.